And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bassano. Dr. David Bassano is an assistant professor of history at Brookdale Community College. He is also the chair of the history department there. He holds a PhD in international history with an emphasis on human rights history. His publications include Fight and Flight, the Central America Human Rights Movement in the United States in the 1980s. He is also a human rights activist and I appreciate this very much because I am too, an avid outdoorsman. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bassano. At this point, I will mute myself and hand things over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that, Sarah. I appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad you could all make it here this morning. I'm pleased to be able to speak with all of you on this topic, something that's quite close to my heart, not just as a human rights topic, but because this is a firsthand account that I'm giving you today. This is something quite personal. What I want to talk about is a trip that I made to the state of Chiapas in Mexico in the summer of 2019. Chiapas, if you don't know, is the southern and easternmost state in Mexico, bordering on Guatemala. And it's also one of the poorest states in Mexico and has a very high indigenous population, who we call the Indians. And there's no coincidence that it's a high indigenous population and also high poverty. I was in Chiapas under the auspices of a group called CEPAS. This is a human rights and peace NGO that was set up in the aftermath of the 1994 EZLN, the Zapatista uprising in Mexico. And they bring delegations down from the United States and Europe to tour Chiapas and also to meet some of the people who are involved in fighting injustice and fighting against human rights violators in Chiapas. And I got to meet with them and interview them. I did publish a version of this talk in a literary magazine called Type House late last year. I think it was September. So to start off with, just to give you an idea of the content of the talk, one of the groups that we met with is a working group, a collective called Cereza, which means it's Spanish for cherries, the Cherry Collective. And this is a group of women who help incarcerated women in Mexico. They help them while they're in prison, and they help them get back on their feet when they're out of prison. There is tremendous stigma against a woman who's been incarcerated in Mexico, can't get a job, can't rent an apartment. So these women help women who are coming out of prison. So as part of the small delegation from the United States, I met with the women of Cereza at their offices. And they were one of them was telling me their story. One of them was formerly incarcerated and she joined Cereza afterwards. And she was telling our group about her experiences in prison. Now, my Spanish is fair to middling. It's okay for traveling, right? I can find the bathroom in order in restaurants and get directions and everything. But for something really with technical language or more specialized language, I need a translator. Luckily, one of the young women in our delegation, she was a graduate student from Puerto Rico, and she was able to translate for me. And she's translating for me. I'm taking notes on what this woman is saying. And she's talking about what she suffered in prison, and it's talking about sexual abuse of women in prison. And I noticed as I was taking notes that I have enough Spanish to know that what that woman was saying was not exactly what my translator was saying, which is a very awkward situation to be in when you're conducting an interview like this. So I let it slide and I just took the notes and thanked her afterwards. And after our group, we went out to have dinner in San Cristobal de las Casas, is a city in Chiapas that we were operating out of. And I bought the translator dinner because she volunteered to translate. Translating can be a very tedious job to do, just repeating over and over what everybody's saying. So I wanted to buy her dinner and thanks. And I asked her over dinner, I said, you didn't repeat word for word what she was saying for you. And she said, I couldn't do it. I could not repeat the words that were coming out of her mouth. It was too terrible. I couldn't say it. I let her slide on that one, of course. But that's, I think, when it really hit me, just what I was dealing with, what the situation was down there in Mexico, and what the people are dealing with. And I promised everyone that I interviewed in Mexico that I would bring their stories out to the world and spread their story as far as I could. And this talk is part of that promise that I made to them. So I'm pleased everybody's come along to hear this story today. So consider the possible, this following scenario. You're in your home one evening with your children when armed police arrive and bang on the door and they demand entrance. Now, you don't speak very much Spanish because you're an indigenous person. You speak your own indigenous language, Nahua or Tzotzil, or one of the other dozens of languages in Mexico. And you, of course, being from a poor family, you have very little formal education. You never learned more than a few words of Spanish. You had to go to work instead of school to support your family. But the cops break down the door and charge in with guns, and you tell your children to run, go to a trusted neighbor's house. And you are detained. You're taken to the local jail, and you're held incommunicado. You can't talk to your family. You can't call a lawyer. And the police try to interrogate you, but you can't understand what they're saying. It's in Spanish. Now, you know the police have translators available, and by law, they're required to bring them in, but there's nobody present. And they put a document on the table in front of you and make it clear they expect you to sign it. And you don't, because you can't read it. Who knows what that says? So they take you to another room and they rough you up pretty good. And they leave you in that room by yourself with no food for 3-4 days, no communication. And finally, when they come and get you back out, you start thinking that if I don't play ball with these guys, I may never see my children again. So you sign that document. And then you put back in jail, and you find out some weeks later that that was a confession to murder you signed. And you remain in jail until your trial, which turns out to be 5 years later, and you have been sentenced to 30 years in federal prison for murder. This scenario happens every single day, many times over and over again in Mexico. There's absolutely nothing uncommon about what I just described. And the question is, why? Arbitrary arrest is the technical term for what I just described. What is it? According to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, an arrest is arbitrary and therefore illegal when it meets at least one of these criteria. It has no basis in law. It's based on discrimination against the detainee. The detainee was denied a fair trial. Someone is detained solely because of their migration status without the involvement of a judge, or someone is detained for the peaceful exercise of their human rights. But why would the police want to arrest someone without good cause? One reason is bribery by the actual perpetrator of a crime. By the way, what I'm describing here, this is from a UN working group. This is not specific to Mexico. This happens in Mexico, but it happens in a lot of places around the world as well. That's why the UN is quite interested. You see, the actual perpetrator of a crime, commits a kidnapping, a robbery, a murder. The police catch up with them. You can pay the cops off. Here's $200. Leave me alone. So the cops take the money, and in countries, poor countries where the police are making very low wage, they are particularly susceptible to bribes. And the problem is somebody has to take the fall, don't they? You can't have all these crimes being committed, and all of a sudden people notice that there's no one in prison, right? The family of the person who was murdered is going to go to the press, is going to go to the politicians. How come nothing's happening? So somebody's got to take the fall. Probably somebody who's helpless, who's defenseless, somebody who's poor, who can't afford a lawyer, someone nobody cares about. if there's a lot of racism against a particular group, they would make a nice fall guy. And it's the indigenous people, the Indians in Mexico, who fit that category. Oftentimes, they don't even speak Spanish or very little, so they make for easy targets. Another reason is extortion. You could have crooked cops, and there's enough of them in Mexico, who will simply try to extort people. Yeah, we're going to take you into prison on these trumped up charges. Give us all you've got, everything in your wallet right now, or else we'll take you in. It can be used to remove an enemy in a personal conflict. You can basically pay the cops to be sort of mercenaries to remove somebody that you don't like. Maybe you're involved, in a love triangle or something like that, or it's a business competitor, and you want that person gone. Yeah, give the cops $300, $400, and they'll trump up some charges against this individual and take them away. Or something that is way too popular around the world in many countries is arbitrary arrest to remove a political activist or an environmental activist or a journalist, someone who's causing trouble for the government at some level. And well, they're killed very often, but if you want to be a little bit more subtle about it, you can just have trumped up charges against them. And I'm going to tell you about one such person later on when I get to the prison interviews. So this is motivation for corruption. Why is this so widespread in Mexico? Mexico has had an extremely tumultuous history, but to keep it in more modern times, to stay in the 20th century and beyond, one of the problems was the corruption of the political party known as the PRI, the Revolutionary Institutional Party in Spanish, or in English of the Spanish. But the PRI was the political party that came to power after the 1920 revolution, and through electoral nonsense, manipulating the ballot, they remained in power uninterrupted certainly I had the presidency and the federal government, but also various state governments and even municipal governments. They had unmitigated sway for 80 years, up until the year 2000, when they finally lost the presidency. And 80 years of a single political party, that concentration of power led to corruption at all levels. They controlled the judges, they controlled all the politics, and so it was easy to be corrupt and have impunity over all this, and they sure did. Another reason for this corruption is poor training for the police. If you don't know how to conduct a difficult investigation and you're catching heat to catch the guy who did this, it's easier just to grab some defenseless Indian off the street and charge them. Nobody cares about them because of the racism anyway. So speaking of the police, poor pay to both the police and the public defenders is another cause of corruption, because they're more susceptible to bribes. They need the money. It's so bad in Mexico that 20% of all the federal police in Mexico are under investigation at any one time, 1/5 of them. And those are just the ones who are under investigation. I'll tell you how bad the situation is. Now, naturally, Mexico has had various reformations trying to fix the justice system, from police all the way up to the Supreme Court. Little changes on the grounds. Corrupt individuals just find ways to get around various laws. And this culture of impunity is what so many of the people that I interviewed were trying to fight against. You see me looking over here, I got one eye on the clock. As I mentioned, the indigenous people of Mexico are the most vulnerable. They suffer from poverty, which is connected to racism, obviously. They have a lack of Spanish language skills, so that contributes to the poverty and difficult to get another job. They can't get formal education because you can't have a child in school. They need to be making money for a poor family, or else how are you going to eat, right? So you get stuck in the intergenerational cycle of poverty. It's estimated that 60% of all the prisoners in Chiapas are indigenous people. Pretrial detention. This is when obviously you're kept in jail while you are awaiting your trial and your sentencing. Bail is available for nonviolent crimes in Mexico, but you grab somebody off the street who can't afford to pay bail. Furthermore, Article 19 of the Mexican Constitution requires pretrial detention for many offenses, including all those of a violent nature. This is an anti-drug cartel law, but it's applied to anybody. 41% of all Mexican prisoners are in pretrial detention. They're just sitting in there and waiting. This is approximately 100,000 people at any one time. And you're supposed to get a hearing before a judicial officer within 72 hours of your arrest, but that is completely disregarded. The delays are one thing, they're due to police need time to plant evidence, to doctor reports on all of these arbitrary arrests. Also, the system is just extremely inefficient. There aren't enough people. I read about cases of people being in pre-trial detention for 7 years, 10 years. One guy was in for 16 years waiting for a trial. They destroyed his life long before the trial. And the judge kept scolding the guy because the guy kept trying to get himself a lawyer. And the judge said, "You're delaying all of this with your trying to get a pro bono lawyer. Just forget the lawyer," right? Well, then you know what's going to happen to the fellow after that. So this system is a disaster. It's very slow, as I mentioned. Some people remain in pre-trial detention for years, to the point where pretrial detention often exceeds the length of the sentence that the judge gives you, and they just let you out after 15, 16 years, which destroys your life. People who go to jail in Mexico, they're poor, they are often abandoned by their families. The food in Mexican prisons is notoriously thin, the diet. Your family has to come and bring you food to survive. But these are poor families. Now, it's very difficult for them to afford to bring food to somebody who's not bringing in an income, and then to get on a bus and spend the day traveling to go to the prison to bring you this food. Sometimes it's more than these overburdened people can bear, and so people end up being abandoned. Women in particular, because then there's the stigma attached to being a woman in a prison. Obviously, you lost your job. They destroy your life. You probably don't have money for bail, even if you were allowed to do it. You don't have money for a private lawyer. The public defenders are notoriously unreliable. They're badly paid. They are susceptible to corruption. Prosecuting attorney will often pay off the public defender and say, "Let's just forget, don't defend this guy, just forget it." And as I mentioned, there's a loss of income that comes from being detained for so long. You're basically rendered dead to society. And you really don't want to be in pretrial detention, or you don't want to be in a Mexican prison at all, as that first interview that I told you about reveals. There's a history of torture and pretrial detention in Mexico. It's in order to secure confessions from people. There are about 2,500 complaints per year against the Mexican justice system of torture in prison. Only about 1 in 20 of those complaints is investigated, and of those that are investigated, only 1% of the case are the investigations ever made public. This is to the point where 64% of all Mexicans reported in a recent poll, 64% said that they were afraid of torture by their own government. There's also abuse in the prison by guards or other inmates with the guards' approval. The guards actually run a protection racket in the prison, will protect you from the other inmates. You pay up. So it is a real dog-eat-dog system. It's an extremely bad place to be. Another problem, we're outside of the British common law system down there. They're using a very old system out of Spain. Criminal trials in Mexico don't have a jury. Well, then how's guilt and innocence determined? There's the judge, the prosecuting attorney, and the defense attorney. They go into a room together, and something happens, which no witnesses are allowed to see, and you're not allowed to see the transcript of what happened. So it's very open to corruption. Now, it's a lot harder to bribe, 12 people or an entire jury. But to bribe a prosecuting attorney or a defense attorney to do nothing, or to bribe a judge, is much, much easier. Especially when you're talking about poor people. Who wants to stick up for them anyway? There's no money in it. So yeah, it's easy for this corruption to continue in Mexico. With all of that background said, let me tell you what I saw and heard when I was down there. This is CERSS number 5. CERSS in Spanish is the acronym for Center for Social Re-adaptation, which, considering what they do to people's lives, is a pretty dark joke. There are 10 such state prisons across Chiapas. This is a state level prison. The white building in front is where you go in and they take your passport and, search you and everything before you go through a tunnel in the back beyond the wall and into the prison grounds. You see right here, it's a little tough to see. This is a sandbag position with a machine gun in it. It's a machine gun nest. It's facing outward. This prison was overrun by the Zapatistas in the 1994 revolt. They overran the prison and let all the prisoners out. So they got guns facing in all directions now. They don't know where the trouble's coming. But after surrendering our passports and everything in our pockets, we were allowed to enter. And I was introduced to a group of 10 men who had formed a collective to fight for their freedom. They were living in a little brick shack that kind of looked like a storage shed, didn't even have a door on it, just a bed sheet hanging over the doorway. No light inside. It was very dark. The floor was just mud. They had to put heavy blankets on the floor, and there were flies crawling all over us the whole time. So their situation is Spartan in the extreme. Nevertheless, when I got there, they made us cups of instant coffee because we were the guests. And they told us about what they were doing. They all claimed that they had been arrested and imprisoned arbitrarily, unjustly, and they were fighting for their rights. To be released, actually to have their cases reviewed and for their release. They had been in prison, each of them between 8 and 20 years, serving sentences that ran between 15 and 29 years. They all claimed that they had been arrested specifically because they were indigenous. They have no money for a lawyer. And they said the real criminals are never in jail. Which, if you met a group of 10 prisoners in jail who told you that, oh no, we're not guilty, none of us here are guilty, you might think, yeah, sure. But after doing the research before this, I'm thinking, actually, yeah, you probably should not be here. The odds are actually in their favor. They complain of a lack of food, that their families have to provide much of it. That's a financial burden on overburdened people. The authorities enjoy humiliating them, won't let them have interpreters. They resort to beating prisoners who try to assert their legal rights, like the right to a review of their case. And that's what they want. They want a review of their case. That's their number one objective. And they say, actually, you have to release every single person in this prison because the system is so corrupt. You cannot genuinely say, you can't assert that anybody here belongs here, that the system is so corrupt, there's no justice, and you have no right to put anybody in jail under such a corrupt system. And their leader was named Pedro Jimenez. He was the most experienced of them. And Pedro Jimenez got his training from a man who's a living legend down in Chiapas. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to meet him, but I heard plenty about him. Rewind back to June of 2000 in Simojovel in Chiapas. There was an ambush of 9 police officers. Now there's still some rebel groups down there. There's a lot of drug cartel activity. For police to get ambushed is not all that unusual. Plus, nobody really likes the police. That doesn't help. one of the two survivors, 7 cops were killed, and 2 of the survivors, one of them was the son of the local municipal president, Ruiz. And so the next thing you know, the municipal president, Ruiz, is looking for somebody to blame for this. And he goes and he finds Alberto Patishtan. And Patishtan had been, he was a local teacher, bilingual. He's from the Totsil tribe, and he was teaching kids in local school. But Patishtan had previously accused Ruiz of corruption through the press. He gave evidence in the press. Here's why this man's embezzling money and everything. So now Ruiz sends the cops to arrest Patishtan. So it looks like this is a good way for them to get rid of Patishtan. So Patishtan was arrested without a warrant. He's charged with organized crime, murder, possession of illegal firearms, that he was involved in this shooting. Now, Patishtan had evidence that he was not involved. He was teaching at the time, and he had 30 students who could tell you where he was exactly at the time of the shooting. There were other inconsistencies in the evidence that was given, but nevertheless, he was tried and given 60 years in prison after waiting 2 years for his trial. This is Alberto Patishtan. He has since been released from prison on a presidential pardon, I'm happy to say, and is back with his people in Chiapas, back in his town of El Bosque. So fast forward again to 2010, when Pedro Jimenez, who's leading the 10 men who I previously mentioned, he meets Alberto Patishtan, who gets sent to CERSS number 5. Patishtan was being moved all over the place because he kept organizing prisoners every place he went. So they kept moving him, but then wherever he showed up, he starts organizing again. And I can still hear Pedro Jimenez in my head telling me the story, very moving. Jimenez, who didn't even speak Spanish at the time, he went up to Patishtan, who was organizing people to protest, and he said, I don't even speak Spanish. I don't have any education. I don't know how I could help you. Should I get involved? And Patishtan said, well, I can't tell you what to do. You decide. And Jimenez said, well, I'd like to help you however I can. And Patishtan, he grabbed Jimenez and he said, now you look me in the eye and you tell me, did you do it? Are you guilty of what they accused you of? And Jimenez said, no, I didn't do it. And Patishtan said, okay, then you can join, because this is only for the innocent. And he taught Jimenez how to speak Spanish, and they began to organize the prisoners, teaching them, here's why you're in prison, here's the corruption that's going on in this country. And so they had a group of dozens of men at one point in CERSS 5. This is before I showed up. 2011, Pedro Jimenez has his first experience in leadership. He leads 15 prisoners plus himself on a hunger strike. Patishtan himself was not involved in this. He let these guys organize and run it themselves. Like, he was kind of watching from the side and guiding. This hunger strike, what they were demanding from the hunger strike was to have their cases reviewed, so that they could be released if they found inconsistencies. And the prison director doesn't want to do it, It went out to the media. That's why you have a hunger strike. It draws attention from the media. They don't want you, the prison director doesn't want you dying in the prison. It makes you a martyr, and then everybody starts asking questions and the media's in on it. And it also, a hunger strike convinces people that you're serious. I don't know how many of you have ever gone 3-4 days without food. It's not fun. And you don't do that. You don't choose to do that unless you're serious about something and makes people take you seriously. These guys went 39 days without food. Finally, they had a judge review their case, and 15 out of the 16 prisoners were released. Oh, we're going to let you go. You shouldn't be in here. The only one they didn't let go was Pedro Jimenez, probably to retaliate against him. But think about this for a minute. They released 15 out of 16 prisoners saying that, okay, you should never have been arrested in the first place. Your trial was incorrect. What does that say? Well, it says one of two things. Either the system that found you guys guilty is virtually 100% corrupt. How could you screw up 15 out of 16 sentences? Or you're releasing these people who you really think are violent criminals, you're releasing them back into society simply because this attention from the press is being a hassle to you, which is also not justice. So which is it? Either way you cut it, the system is corrupt. Jimenez told me that he has since suffered a lot of retaliation from the government. He and his men have been, they've withheld medical treatment from the men who needed it. They tried dispersing prisoners to other locations. This is a typical thing with prison groups. You try to break them up by splitting everybody into different prisons. But all they did was spread the seed, because the men who were sent to different prisons started groups in those different prisons. Patishtan himself was finally released on a presidential pardon in 2013. I was told that the prison directors are constantly trying to break up and intimidate the group. They tried to have other prisoners go in and start fights with them to provoke them into fights that, then the government can say, oh, you see, these guys are violent. They try to play this game with them. And in December of 2017, Jimenez publicly denounced the director of the prison for all the various corruption that is going on in the prison, sending these rats into the group to try to break them up. And when it hit the press, then the director was removed, and they brought in a new director who was a woman, which is very unusual to have a female prison director in Mexico. But when this new director came in, she immediately sent Jimenez 1,000 miles away to a different prison in Sinaloa, and did that to make it so his family couldn't visit him. It's a torture to him. And so the groups that are involved in prison justice, like No Estamos Todos and these other NGOs and working groups on the outside, this is how the prison groups survive. They have help from the outside who get the money and food, and they connect them with lawyers who are willing to work pro bono. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you're fighting for your rights against corruption, rule number one, never fight alone. You will lose. You have to connect with other people. And there are many other activists out there, no matter what the situation is. So that's the first thing you do, is connect with others. And they get help from the outside. That's how the press knows about the situation. So when Jimenez is sent to this prison, he's met by the prison director there, says, oh, I've heard about you. You're the little lawyer. And they take him to another room and they box his ears. This is a torture where you smack your hands against somebody's ears as hard as you can. And what it does is it compacts the air. You get air compression in the ear canal, which is extremely painful and can break the eardrum if it's done hard enough. But torturers like it because it doesn't leave any marks on the body. There's no evidence of torture. So they roughed them up. And finally, the lawyers coming from No Estamos Todos, the group name means we're not all here, referring to the people in the prison. They get Jimenez returned, and he gets back, and the new prison director in CERSS 5, the woman who sent him away, she said, oh yeah, she said, you know who's famous here? You're famous. But you see, I'm not corrupt. I don't have any corruption here at this prison. Isn't that true? Now, Jimenez saw that this is a threat, an implicit threat, because if he doesn't agree with her that there's no corruption at this prison under her tutelage, things could go badly for him. But instead, he says, I'm laughing because I can still see him standing in front of me telling me this story. He says, well, actually, I just got here, so no, I don't know how you run things in here. Solitary confinement. And they left him in solitary to rot until the lawyers got on that again and got him out. And this was where the situation stood when I showed up for the interview. They told me that they're not afraid, they're not discouraged. They're going to continue to fight for their release until it actually works. We were, yes, these are the working groups. I think we can post these in the chat afterward. No Estados Tomos, no Todos Osamos, Voice of Amate and Voice of Cianos are two other prison groups in different CERSS prisons around Chiapas. And they are all connected with each other. You know, they move the prisoners around, and they find other prisoners who are already in groups, and they get there. This was a protest to free Alberto Patishtan outside of CERSS 5. I also met 4 men who were conducting a hunger strike. They were, the name of their group was Voices in Resistance. Originally, they started with 7 men in March of 2019. It was 100, let me get the number right. Yes, 114 days of hunger strike when I met them. They were living in a tent, a handmade tent that they built on the lawn next to the medical building in the prison on the grounds. They were in such bad physical shape, they needed to be real close to emergency services, but they didn't like being in the medical center because they had to be shackled to the bed all the time. So they lived in this tent that they'd made right next door, and they were sleeping on blankets. And they were all huddled up in blankets because hunger gives you chills. It makes you feel cold, messes with your electrolytes. They were surviving on water and honey, and our group bought them containers of honey. Just to show everybody, yeah, we're not exactly neutral in this. And they told us that there had been arbitrary arrest, the same kind of story the guys from Jimenez's group told us, corruption in their sentencing. They had been sentenced, each one of them, to 25 years in prison on trumped up charges. They were in bad physical shape. They would develop infections, and then the medical site would give them IVs of antibiotics, and then would get infections at the site of the IV. They had gotten themselves a new public defender because the original one they had was useless, but then they were punished in retaliation for getting a new public defender. The prison succeeded in breaking up the group to some extent. It told them, okay, we'll review your cases if you guys will agree to be sent away to different prisons. And 3 of the 7 took the deal and were moved out to different prisons. I don't know if they got their freedom. So I was talking to the 4 who remained when they were there. And we had to stop the interview because one of the local politicians had come to visit to ask them to stop their hunger strike, because it was making them look bad in the press. And it was clear that these guys were going to deny said request. If somebody comes and asks you to stop, that just encourages them. Oh, well, it must be doing some good, huh? This is one of their flyers. This is on the website of No Todos Osamos. I don't know if you can see it. No more bars until everyone is free. As you can see, their defiant spirit remains unbroken. Yes, they're a little bit irritated at having their lives stolen from them. The 4 men that I met, and they post statements online what their beliefs are, their manifesto. And by the way, before I go on to the Cereza Collective, one more thing. These guys are still in prison. What happened was, and this is incredible, they actually agreed to review their cases. And the judge who reviewed their cases extended their sentences further another 25 years. He doubled their sentences on review. And they released a statement that said the reason for this was the judge demanded a bribe and we didn't pay it. So the original reason we got tossed in jail for 25 years is because we didn't bribe the original judge. Now this new judge tried to do the same thing. We refused to pay the bribe, which is they all stick together on this. They all refuse to do anything illegal, no bribes. And the judge slapped another 25 years on them. So now they each have 50 years in prison, which of course they're appealing. They had to stop the hunger strike because they could die at any moment. So they went to a reduced strike where they're only eating once a day. And that's how they continue to this day in that tent. Real quick, I'd like to talk about the Cereza Collective because these women deserve a book to themselves. They are amazing. This is the group that I told you about in the beginning that I met. It's a feminist group. They support incarcerated women, both before and after leaving prison. Their most visible effort is a transit house. It's a halfway house called Casa Cereza. So women who come out of prison have a place to stay when they get out of prison. They've often been abandoned by their families. And it's all the women who come out of prison, they run it themselves. It's a collective. It's very cooperative. Nobody knows that this is a halfway house for female prisoners. They tell the neighbors that it's for women who have been abused, victims of domestic abuse, because there's such a stigma against women in prison. And there's no renter rights in Mexico. The landlords in the past, if they found out what this house was, they would just kick them out, and it was legal for them to do so. I think this was their third halfway house they set up. They keep getting chased out. It's called the Cereza Collective because look what they did, right? The prison was called CERSS. So they feminized the acronym by putting an A at the end, and which instead I call it Cereza, cherry in Spanish. Very clever. So the collective, it's self-organizing. It's not top-down. They asked the women, what do you want? And they said, well, we need a halfway house. We need a job. And so that's what they did. At the time, there were, or the households, 5 people. They had one that held 14. They got run out of that one. There were 4 women living there. 50 women have used the halfway house in total. Some stay for one night, some stay for months. They help them get jobs. What they did was they set up with one of the local universities. One of the local universities has like a coffee place, like a Starbucks, and the university agreed only to hire Cereza women, so they have some job available for them, because they have to pay the rent on the house somehow, you know. The outreach to the women in prison is very difficult. The women don't trust them. They don't know who they are. It takes a long time for them to build up trust, but they've done it just person to person. They set up an online education system in the prison where the local universities offer online, like Zoom style classes to the women. They could get certificates in Spanish language, right? They're indigenous women, so they learn how to speak Spanish through this program. They also reconnect them with their families when they get out. Even if these women are actually immigrants from Guatemala or El Salvador, they will connect them over international borders. And they also collect and present legal evidence to have their cases reviewed. They get them pro bono lawyers. The woman who I spoke to who had suffered in prison, she was now in law school. She's studying to be a lawyer herself. When the coronavirus hit the prison, the guards were so scared, they basically abandoned the prisoners to their fate. I mean, the women's section of the prison didn't have water. How are you going to handle this? They called up the ladies of Cereza, who got themselves a pickup truck and look at all the toilet paper, and they loaded it up with food. There's cooking facilities in the prison, and they basically made a care package run over and over again to the women who were in prison. So they are doing a lot of direct on the ground work. They are just doing spectacular work. I love them to death. I think we can pop this in the chat if you want to see it. These are the working groups and NGOs that are working for justice in Chiapas. If you want to make a donation to anybody or investigate further, this is a good place to start. The Fray Bartolome Center is an actual NGO. The others are just collectives. Well, and so is CEPAS, that's an NGO. The others are just collectives. They're just working groups, as they call themselves, but they've got a web presence too.
Thank you, everyone. Take care, stay well, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.